Welcome to episode 3 of our podcast, Learning Talmud with Rabbi Yeshua. This is going to be building on our previous episodes, and this one is about the rabbis as reformers and looking at the formative, years of halakha before it started to become canonized in the Mishnah and Talmud, and looking at how the rabbis began to develop different ways of thinking about the Torah as a code of living, of governing people's lives as a community and as individuals in relationship with God and each other. So the last episode, we focused on broadening our understanding of Torah from just a written document to a multifaceted oral and written tradition that works in unison to flesh out the nature of the Torah. This week, we're going to build on the themes we saw in the Deuteronomy and prophet sections, where the temple kind of begins to decline and the Mosaic judges begin to take a greater role in teaching and leading Israel as a nation. This week, we will end by looking at the Sermon on the Mount as a halachic document and beginning to understand its purpose and utility in greater depth. So the first part is going to just be a little bit of history, looking at the decline of the priesthood and how it became more of a political function than a religious function, even though it's always had political undertones. And I guess it served the people as a place of judgment and things like that, but it became a secular symbol rather than a religious one. So this started with a group mostly called the Hashmonaean dynasty. They were a family, and they rose to power in the wake of the Hanukkah revolt against Hellenism. And we all know the story of Hanukkah. However, their rise to power would eventually give rise to a Hellenistic partnership between king, Roman state, and the Jewish priesthood. So the Jewish king Yani was both king and priest, despite the fact that his priestly lineage was called into question and disputed. So the sages of the Talmud criticize him for taking the crown of priesthood and kingship. So we can already see a bit of a power dynamic or a struggle between the communal leaders, these Mosaic judges that are the rabbis and sages, and the more kind of aristocratic, power-hungry state leaders. So Ezra and Nehemiah brought reforms from the exile, and they did this to reduce and correct the issues from the previous generations that had caused the exile, mainly idol worship and not being able to engage with God due to the distance people lived from the only sacred space of Torah learning, really, that was the temple. So some of the reforms that they brought was changing the script of the Torah to the commonly used one used by the exile community, and that way they could actually engage all people from all levels of society to actually engage with reading and understanding the Torah. They engaged in weekly Torah readings and public education and essentially free education. It's quite a big public service and innovation for its time, really. So the sages themselves were busy during this period. They were engaging with the Mosaic court system, developing it, and using it functionally to uplift and support the Jewish people. The Maccabean period is home to some of the most famous rabbis, such as Rabbi Yosef ben Yoza and Yosef ben Yochanan. This time period, halakha was used in a very specific way and a fundamental way to show us its roots as a pro-social and people-centered approach to a covenant life. So the sages, some of whom were priests, took the role of teacher and judge as well, and educator, but they took it out of the more hereditary, distant place of the temple, and they brought it to a more common place where people could actually engage with it without having to go into the temple or without being part of wealthier members of society or something that more common people could actually understand and engage with. So the corrupt priesthood and Hellenism kind of went together. They started to influence each other, and we're going to take a little brief snapshot of that and just see how the two began to morph together into their own kind of organism. So prior to the famous War of the Maccabees with their Greek rulers, the priesthood had become corrupt, and the upper class of Jewish society saw that Hellenism, or Greek culture, was a good way to gain control over the Jewish population. The book of Maccabees informs us of the priests working in collaboration with Antiochus, who would defile the temple with unclean animals. So they already had this kind of unholy union with their enemy. The influence of Hellenism would soon begin to corrupt the upper classes of the Jewish people, and the Jewish people and those families would begin to identify more as Greeks than as Jews. So after the Maccabees won this miraculous victory over the Seleucids, the Greek overlords, they began to take the role of both kings and priests. And now the Talmud brings us a little snapshot of that corruption in the Babylonian Talmud in a tractate called Pesachim 57a. That's the address if you want to look it up in Sepharia. And it discusses the upper class families and their behavior. And it says as follows: Woe is me because of the house of Botheus. Woe is me because of their staves. Woe is me because of the house of Hanin. Woe is me because of their whisperings. Woe is me because of the house of Cathros. Woe is me because of their pens. Woe is me because of the house of Ishmael. Woe is me because of their fists. For they are high priests, and their sons are temple treasurers, and their sons-in-laws are trustees, and their servants beat the people with staves. So essentially, they're going through this kind of dynastic passing on of these entrusted wealthy positions that weren't really earned or, I guess, sanctioned by Torah, but became part of their culture, and how they began to use this to oppress the actual common Jewish people. Thus, they began to create animosity between themselves and the common Jew, right? Or between the Sadducees and the Pharisees. You begin to see this in the New Testament, these tensions kind of bubbling up. The book of Maccabees tells us that the priest's tutor Jason, who was given the priesthood during the time leading up to the Maccabean revolt, the book of Maccabees gives us more information on the corruption that the priests were doing under a priest called Jason, who was given the right of priesthood. So Maccabees 4:14 tells us this: So the Greek way of life caught on very quickly, and the adoption of foreign customs increased because of Jason, an excessively wicked and ungodly man who was no high priest. Even the priests were no longer devoted to the service of the altar, but they treated the temple with contempt. They neglected the sacrifices. They hurried to practice in lawless wrestling spectacles in the arena as soon as the discus throwing event was announced. They ignored their ancestral honors and sought after Greek status symbols instead. So as you can see, they started to become more Greco-Roman and less involved with the actual content of the priesthood, with the honor and service of God. So there was a clash with how the poor and the needy were viewed in Greek society and Jewish society. So the Greeks didn't really look so kindly upon the poor generally. However, in Jewish society, it was an obligation to God and man to actually look after them. It's part of our covenantal bond, or if you lived in the United States, you'd say it's part of our constitutional rights. So this gives us a bit more context to the clashes between the rabbis who actually represented the common Jew, the common man, and the Sadducees who represented the wealthier upper class. So the sages were really socially leaning in their outlook, and they took responsibility towards public service, education, helping the poor, the widow, the orphan. Rabbinic Judaism would begin providing public education opportunity for the poor in the community, and thus they would actually enable the common person to rise up through education to become somebody in the world, much like society today. For example, Hillel, who was just a poor and humble woodcutter who denied his family's wealth to earn his own wages, eventually, because of his own learning and ability, would become leader of the Sanhedrin. We can see the sages' religious and social reforms beginning all the way back with Ezra and Nehemiah. According to the Talmud, they would institute public services, engage with community, and take away some of the roadblocks that the poor people had encountered previously in their relationship with God and the Torah. They would make it easier for the common person to actually become part of Jewish society on a social and religious level. So the rabbis would make education the mark of their leadership, as opposed to wealth or status symbols or Greco-Roman policies and partnerships. So it was one of the most highly valued parts was Torah learning. So they even had a statement that would fly in the face of the elite upper class. A Gentile who studies Torah is considered a high priest. Now, based on all the content that we've just looked at before, that context, we realize that this is a bit of a slap in the face and a stir and like a dig at those people who are actually illegitimate high priests. They're saying Gentiles, tax collectors, gladiators, if they study Torah, they have even greater or just the same level of holiness as these so-called high priests that we have going today. So that was a bit of a takedown of the establishment, slur at it.